So that was a really great research report findings from Hyatt. And now we're going to move on to the panel section. And this is going to be a really great panel. I mean, obviously, individually, every single person here could just go on and on and on about all of their thoughts that they're having. And we're just really excited to hear it. When we were having some conversations, just the flow of conversation was really exciting. So I just can't wait for everybody else to hear what folks have to say. So maybe I'll get started and it could be popcorn style, or we can kind of get started however we want, or just kind of like down the line. But just introduce yourself, kind of like what's your connection to Laidlaw, and yeah, like who you are, where you work, that kind of stuff. And then we'll go into some more moderated questions, and then we'll go into the Q&A portion of the event.
Cool. Good. Cool. Hi, Ani. Hi everyone. Me and Doughty see Caceila. So that means my name is Caceila in Mi'kmaq. Shubwejagan Nindishnakas Makwadodam Boateng Ndojaba. So my spirit name is Magical Being. I'm from Boateng or Sault Ste. Marie, and I'm Bear Clan. I'm proud to be here. I am a mixed race person, so not only am I Anishinaabe and Mi'kmaq, I am also Irish, French, Canadian, and British. I'm proud of all my ancestors and my grandmothers, and I'm very happy to be here. Some of the titles I hold, I have 2 grassroots organizations that have been funded through Laidlaw Foundation over the years that I've co-founded with other Indigenous youth. So I have Boateng Child Welfare Warriors, as well as Youth O'Dana. And I currently am the director of Ontario Indigenous Youth Partnership Project.
Amazing. Carissa.
Hi, Carissa Uyuna, Inuktitut Atira Inuyak. My name is Carissa. My Inuktitut name is Inuyak. My mother's side of my family originates from Nunatsiavut, which is Eastern Canada, Northern Labrador. And then my father's side of my family is a settler from Britain. And same, I had a moment for years where I was uncomfortable claiming that because there's so much shame between the communities, but exactly that. Yeah, I'm proud of both sides of my family. I'm very fortunate to have the family that I do and the support that they've given me. I've been with Laidlaw now on the Indigenous Youth Advisory Council, I think for 4 years. And it's been amazing to read some of the youth projects, the culture projects that are coming in, you know, the various ideas and priorities that various communities have across Ontario. I know it's across Canada, but fund is for Ontario. So it's been great to be a part of the Indigenous Advisory Council. Outside of that, I just recently graduated from Carleton University with my degree in Human Rights and Social Justice with a minor of Indigenous Studies. And I recently moved from the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations office into the Senator of Nunavut's office. So just working at changing policy for not only Inuit, but other groups who have been made marginalized by colonial violence. And I don't like to say marginalized communities. I think they're communities made marginalized. So that's just a vocabulary is important, just a little distinction.
Amazing. Thanks for that. I love that distinction. Also, I'm hearing a little bit of oohs and ahs. If you want to do more of that. These people are very amazing. Ben, over to you.
Hard to follow. Benjamin Mitsuk. I'm a Labradorian Inuit. Inuit Simavunga Halifax. Kita Atava Nunavunga Amane Nunatsiavut. Iliku Siligini Alalitsiu Bunga Nunatsiavut Kavamani. Amalu Itivauta Julia Laidlaw Foundation Board of Directors. So good afternoon or good evening, everyone. My name is Benjamin Mitsuk. I'm Labrador Inuk. I was born in Halifax, but I currently am living between Ottawa and Nain Nunatsiavut. That's because I just began a job as Director of Culture for the Nunatsiavut government. The Vice Chair of the board of directors of the Laidlaw Foundation. I joined the board in 2021 after Janine reached out to me. I was initially part of the granting committee for the first couple of years, and I was also on the governance and recruitment committee, which I'm now the chair of. And I'm also on the executive committee. Prior to shifting to my current position with UNACIABUD, I worked for 4 years at IYCFF Academy in the Policy Advancement Department. And I also founded a national nonprofit organization called Justice Trans, which is about improving access to justice for trans and gender non-conforming individuals in Canada, in so-called Canada. So it's nice to be here.
Thank you, Ben. More who's in office.
Ani po jo oskin ang plan de Japan nation min dum bar and sound inji no doram. My name's Janine Manning. My spirit name, as I just said, is New Star Woman. I am from the Anishinaabe or Chippewas of Nawash First Nation. I currently live in my territory, not in my First Nation, in Owen Sound. I'm the past chair of Laidlaw Foundation. My term wrapped up.
Yeah.
I stuck it out for 7 years on the board.
Wow.
And currently I'm an elected band counselor of my First Nation. I've given up all other duties except for parenting to take on this this position. It's everything I thought it would be and more. Thing or nothing. Yeah, I don't know what more to say than that, other than what I whispered to Ben. I profusely recruited him to the board, and I was so happy they took up my pitch.
Thanks, Janine. And Janine was and is obviously an amazing woman, but when you were at the helm of Laidlaw Foundation, you really spearheaded it in a way that was so different than what we've ever had for the foundation. And so we thank you so much for your service. Yes, last and not least.
Wake no wake, Kris, Archie, and West, Cotton Gilmo, and Zeskin. I am so deeply honored to be here alongside all of you lovely humans. Some of you are new faces to me, some of you are ones that we've been around the block a bit. And also to the folks in the room, there's some long friendships here. So just thank you for the invitation. I'm the CEO of the Circle on Philanthropy. I've been with the organization for 8 years now, and my relationship with Laidlaw began in the first month of my work with the Circle on Philanthropy. Myself and a board member at that time, Elisa Levi, came and did a facilitation of one of the very first youth meetings of the youth granting committee. And we talked to them about ways in which they could think and do differently in their work to, take up the cause to redistribute the money in a good way. And so it was a really amazing thing to come and to be in this space. And we went out to the Six Nations, had some strawberry drink, which was very delicious and amazing. But one of the things that I love about the work that we do at the Circle is to work alongside Indigenous member organizations and settler philanthropic organizations as they kind of live out their commitment to think and do their work differently, which is ultimately to see increased dollars to Indigenous-led organizations and to see philanthropic organizations shift practice and policy for the long haul, not just for the moment, not just a bit of money here or there, but for many, many years. And so it's always been delightful to see the way that Laidlaw has been a leader in this space. Bringing in Janine to be the inaugural, the first ever Indigenous president of the board of a family foundation was not something that went unnoticed. Like, that was a statement in a place that is wildly conservative, and that demonstrates true leadership. And so we're delighted that Laidlaw is a member of the Circle on Philanthropy, and just glad to be here. Sure.
Amazing, thank you so much. Didn't I tell you it's gonna be a great? Alrighty, so, a couple of questions that I have for you, and then we'll open it up to everybody else, including the folks online. So folks online, if you have any questions, feel free to put it in the chat and we'll make sure one of our staff member reads them out for you. But in the meantime, folks on the panel, and then we can start whoever wants to go first. We're talking about the 10 years since the signing of the declaration. And I want to get your perspective on what you've been kind of seeing in terms of changes in the philanthropic sector, good or bad, obviously. But what has this past decade looked like for you in terms of where the philanthropic sector is going? So, any takers? Ben, go for it.
Jump right in. So I didn't join Laidlaw until 2021. And prior to joining Laidlaw, my experience with the philanthropic sector was almost zero. I knew about it in theory and in passing, but I had no connections to it. I had no interest in it. And I think there's a large, that says a fair bit about how inaccessible it was to me as someone who is Indigenous, queer, trans. It's not a space that I saw or have been invited to take part in. So when I joined the board in 2021, during my first board meeting, I remember Janine explaining that she would not be giving the land acknowledgement, and that everybody else who wasn't Indigenous would be giving the acknowledgements. And this seems so obvious, so straightforward, but it isn't. I haven't seen that done in a boardroom or in more typically conservative spaces. So that was a massive green flag for me, and that's why part of why I stayed. And just touching on the land acknowledgement, you know, Laidlaw has gone further than the words. I've seen Laidlaw put those words into action. And if you look at Laidlaw's land acknowledgement, which has been very thoughtfully written, it states that acknowledgement must be accompanied by unequivocal support for Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. I've witnessed the establishment and expansion of the Indigenous Youth and Community Futures Fund, Janine Manning rocking it as chair of the board, including through sometimes difficult conversations. Laidlaw's continued involvement with the Indigenous community, whether it's through the Indigenous Youth Advisory Council, the Circle on Philanthropy and Aboriginal Peoples in Canada, and of course by hiring Indigenous staff and ensuring that there are Indigenous board members and continuing to decolonize our grantee reporting practices. We'll leave it there.
Amazing, thank you. Anybody else wanna? Yeah, Janine, go for it.
So I drove here from my home this morning, and in deciding what to wear, I chose to wear this ribbon skirt because it had the butterfly on it. For me, I thought it's representative of what we're talking about today, what Laidlaw has been doing in the sector in the last 10 years. You know, it represents change, growth, renewal, and that's what I've witnessed with Laidlaw. My involvement with Laidlaw was, I think, 10 years ago when Elisa Levi asked me to be a community consultant on the first report to inform the work that then became the Indigenous Advisory Council and the Indigenous Youth Community Futures Fund. At that time, I was a recent law school dropout. Ben and I know each other from university. And in reading that report, they asked me to do a review. I got really choked up and there were tears, and it was like tears of joy and accomplishment, honor to be such a part of this lengthy journey. At that time when I was asked to be a community advisor, I didn't know anything about philanthropy. I only knew that we were, where I was working at the time, Teach for Canada, was a recipient of funds from Laidlaw Foundation. So then that's when I started kind of challenging myself to learn more. And you know, to come onto the board 7 years ago, it was really intimidating. Despite a lot of the reports and work we try to do on the ground, there are still old values that I felt up against strongly a lot of times. But yeah, you know, realizing how far the foundation had come, I also realized how far I had come as an individual, as a single Indigenous woman. I remember when I came to do the interview for the board, and they asked me if I had any accommodation needs, and I was like, yeah, I have my son, daycare's closed, and so they're like, yeah, bring him in, we have a children's room. And I felt that was my signal that I think that I felt I belonged and I was welcomed and I'd be supported. You know, now I've gone from law school dropout, my son being 8 years old, to being an elected bank counselor, to my son being 16 in grade 12. And you know, I relate my growth to the growth of this foundation, and it feels very intimate, very personal for me. And I hope that folks that follow our work, because I know that we've been told that so many other peer organizations look to us for inspiration and how to decolonize and do things better. And I hope they witness that growth in those demarcations in time like I do. Yeah, so for me, that this connection to Laidlaw, I feel like I've developed a new family. Like I know I've made lifelong friends, and you know, I was gifted this today, and you know, that was very meaningful to me. So yeah, and I just want to say that this is a huge sector. I don't think people realize it. Like many people don't really know the sector. I, you know, didn't before Laidlaw, and this is just one organization, a smaller one in comparisons to many. And I just think about the impact that this sector could and would have on Indigenous communities and individuals if, you know, all the organizations in this sector followed the lead of Laidlaw, or at least picked up some of the wise practices that, you know, they've been implementing. I think about, you know, all of the programs for youth that would be funded, all of the, you know, language programs and activities and connections that can be made to each other in the land. And, you know, I just hope that this report adds to that collection of great work, to let other folks know this is what Laidlaw has been doing. And the one thing I really, really appreciate about 10 years ago being that community advisors, you know, it was an organization that was willing to, as I would refer to it in my teachings, walk back their history before moving forward. And as, you know, an Indigenous leader, as an Indigenous consultant, as, you know, someone who's been approached by allies, so many people are unwilling and uncomfortable to actually look back and to admit where their missteps are, to learn from them, to move forward. And I think Laidlaw has successfully done that, you know, despite the discomfort, has gotten through it, and, you know, to really pave a path for folks to follow. Which
Yeah. I think that's a really good segue into Carissa.
Well, I was gonna, as I've been listening to things that have been being said, it makes me think about how, like, we're in the first 10 years of really what we're seeing now, which is a lot more just, you know, non-Indigenous people learning about Indigenous history, learning about Canadian history, I should say, because Indigenous history spans so much further beyond Canada's. And I mean, we're, you know, over 100 years into colonization in Canada, a couple hundred. If you're especially talking about the East Coast and Nunavut being colonized earlier. And anyways, I won't get into the history lesson, but it's been over 100 years of violent, like cultural dispossession, dehumanization, oppression, taking away of, you know, rights, which have ultimately affected the social detriments of health of Indigenous people. And as an Indigenous country, everyone, you know, talks about Canada strong, but how can we be a stronger country without actually recognizing our own history? And we're in that first 10 years and there's a lot of room to grow, I think. There's definitely, you know, uncomfortable conversations. There's also, you know, we're coming up to false claims of identity and who's Indigenous and who's not Indigenous. And there's a lot of figuring out, like there's a lot of dust in the air right now, and we need to make sure that we're also patient with the communities, but also with the various foundations, just of that process, and willing to be uncomfortable and willing to have these conversations so that together we can become stronger as a society, as an economy. Right now, I know Canada's economy is a little bit tight, but the first thing I think about is if our economy crashes, the people who are already at the bottom rung are going to be impacted the most. And we've been seeing a lot of these programs over the last 10 years. You know, there's midwifery programs, there's learning from elders, like the intergenerational sharing of knowledges, language. There's so many, I'm not going to list them all, but these are all things that are helping build up the capacity of our own communities. And I only think about it, how strong could Canada be if all of these youth were actually given the resources and the capacity building that would help them feed back into their own communities and therefore Canada as a whole and as a country. And I mean, Canada, there's a whole bunch of political warfare going on, not only in Canada, but in the globe right now. But I think it's so important to not become more divided and not, you know, silo individual barriers that, you know, this community is facing, let's say low or food insecurity or housing insecurity. Well, that's also happening in however many other communities, and things are so siloed right now. And that's also a lot of Western ideology, and Western ideology has us break things down into a list and fit them into boxes. But within Western or non-Western understandings, not only in Indigenous cultures, but other cultures globally, there's more holistic approach. So I think that's really where, like, moving forward, we need to look at how can we continue contributing to building the capacity, not only of youth, but communities, you know, children, youth, and their families, but also, building the capacity, but also just really looking forward to how we can continue to just become better versions, not only for ourselves now, but for the next generation, for future Canadians, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. I think that's something that we really see a lot is the us versus them dichotomy. And I think that is just so divisive. It's important, that's definitely, to have our distinct social groups and to understand those differences and not have like a monolith or like a melting pot of cultures. But it's also very important to see the similarities. And I think that's what I've seen in the last 10 years. Like I said, there's so much more to go from here. It's at a good spot, so I don't want to rain on the parade, but I definitely think
Okay.
I would say, like, taking away like different perspectives, right? Like this different perspectives. Our world is indoctrinated in Western ideology. And there's so many cultures that have so much more to offer that we as the generation now really need to keep our ears open and to listen to those various ways of understanding and just really learn how to become more healthy society. Yeah.
I might have a little rain. I might have.
I mean, this is the space for you to rain on it.
Okay, so in 2011, I joined Vancouver Foundation as a manager to do some work around child welfare and youth homelessness, and was leading a project around supporting foster kids when they left foster care to be supported like their parents at age 26. And I was sitting in my desk on the day I got an email that there was this thing that had just happened, which was the Philanthropic Community's Declaration for Action. And in that email was an attachment of the declaration, and on the list of signatories said Vancouver Foundation. I was the only Indigenous person at that organization at that time, and had been the first Indigenous staff member of that organization in its 60+ year history, and was one of maybe 3 Indigenous people working in community foundations across this country at that time. And I read the declaration and I cried at my desk. I thought, oh my goodness, this is the moment that things can really change. This is a sector with billions of dollars and a ton of social capital and influence. And they just said this thing, and then they signed it, and then they rolled it up and they put it inside of a bentwood box. I'm from the West Coast. I know what a bentwood box means. I know the significance of the meaning of putting it inside of a treasure box. So I was so deeply moved and was really delighted to see that the organization I was working with was like, yeah, we did this thing. Unfortunately, we kind of existed at a time in the sector when it used to be enough to say words and to sign paper, and that would create all the change that you could imagine. But we know now, in today's language, we would call that performative. We would say it's not enough to write a thing, say a thing, put it in a box and walk away, right? So we know that the times have changed and our behavior must follow accordingly. And sadly, broadly across the sector, the circle at our count in 2017 had about 85 signatories to the Philanthropic Declaration of Action. I can say with pretty good confidence that of our 50 or so philanthropic organizations, less than 10% of them would be considered philanthropic declaration signatories. And of that, they're probably still the most progressive organizations who've been taking action on the Philanthropic Declaration. So you had 85 people stand up and sign a thing, and maybe 15, to be frank, across this country from coast to coast to coast, maybe 15 philanthropic organizations have actually demonstrated a commitment to ongoing investment in Indigenous communities by capital transfers, investing differently, and by grant making, including having the right people on board, hiring the right amazing people in their organizations, etc. So of course, we've seen some amounts of money increase to Indigenous organizations. We know that absolutely that has happened. But don't let the big numbers fool you. It's still not enough. It's still less than 1% of philanthropic dollars in this country go to Indigenous organizations. And the people who are doing that research, they're still categorizing it without a definition of what's Indigenous led and what's not, right? So we know the number's even lower. Yes, many, many millions of dollars have gone to Indigenous organizations over the last 10 years, and that is to be celebrated. And it still can improve. It can still get better. It can still go from less than 1% to at least 5%. We'd love to see 15 or 20% of annual grant making contributions or capital transfer and investments being focused on Indigenous communities where organizations live and work or where they built their money. In 2017 and in 2018, Shireen and I went on a bit of a mini campaign to try and create some new language in the sector, and we started using the language of a settler philanthropic organization. We were saying, you know what, we're really sick and tired of everyone saying Indigenous philanthropy and only talking about money to Indigenous organizations. No, Indigenous philanthropy has been here and continues to be here since the beginning of time. We are not the infants when it comes to philanthropic behavior in this country, right? The settler philanthropic sector, it is. And it has lots to learn. And organizations like Laidlaw and others are the ones who come to the table and said, let us figure out how to do this better. And they did mostly listen. And then they heeded the advice and guidance of the Indigenous people around them. And I think that's the invitation that we're at now, at 10 years. You could not talk about white supremacy. You could not talk about settler philanthropic organizations. You could not ask philanthropic organizations to admit where their money came from. These are commonplace practices now. now more and more like grant advisories know that they need to consider who are actually Indigenous led organizations. So they use the I4DM to figure that out. And people are no longer giving money to organizations that just benefit the Indigenous people, right? They're actually getting into the hands of Indigenous organizations. So we have come a long way. And there has been so many amazing initiatives and programs that have happened. But it's not enough. It's not enough. And we look forward to hosting our all members gathering next week in Vancouver with a recommitment ceremony that invites folks to step in yet again for another 10 years with hopefully even more action so that in 10 years time, we can have a celebration, you know, and not just a look at what we could have done. Good things have happened, but it can only continue to get better. I really believe that.
Thank you for, yeah. I hope the funders in the room, including ourselves, Laidlaw, are taking notes, because those were golden nuggets of information. And I think it's always really important to not just talk about like the positive, but also like the realities, right? Like, yes, it's nice that like we've gotten to a certain point, but then what, right? Like what else is happening next? And so Kris is always a great reminder of that, but I think there needs to be more of that in the sector, period.
Maybe because Kris is beside me that I feel fire coming on.
Exactly.
And I think just before we move on to like another thing to note is, I don't keep on meaning to bring the government into this, but we're seeing a lot of budget cuts right now, and a lot of funding is being cut from Indigenous programs. And now is the time more than ever where these sectors, the private sector, needs to step up and say, okay, these gaps that are being created, we're not going to let these youth fall through those gaps. I'm not going to go on to a long-winded story. I know we have other topics about, but
NCC has yet to.
Yeah, because this is perfect timing. So I was going to tell you a story about when I started in philanthropy, and maybe I'll get to that. But what this panel is really sparking me is that Indigenous youth across our country and specifically in Ontario that I can see are suffering because of the cuts to Jordan's Principle.
Oh yeah.
So, you know, not only was Jordan's Principle helping with things like subsidizing housing and, you know, basic need costs for survival of families, also access to education and healthcare is extremely at risk right now. So youth are literally, as we are sitting here gathering and all of our privilege, are suffering and are not able to go to school tomorrow. And so we're dealing with that. And I think that that's more important than any story I was going to tell you. I really think that we need to, if Jordan's Principle, this government structure that was holding up so much of our livelihood of our young folks that have been oppressed through 7 generations and now are facing this, is going to pull the magic carpet, if you will, out from underneath these youth, that we need to collectively find a new system to make sure our kids can go to school, to make sure our kids can see a doctor, to make sure our kids are eating in house. Like, you know, re-evolving who we are, reclaiming our teachings, all of that is very important, but it will not be there if our kids are not able to get up and be healthy and be happy and feel safe in their own communities, in their own homes, with their own families. That's so important. So I guess I'll start there. Woo! But the last 10 years, I actually grew up in philanthropy. The first grant I ever wrote, I was living in Sudbury, Ontario, and it was an Ontario Trillium Foundation grant. I didn't get it. You're gonna get some no's along the way. But I started and I was working for a non-Indigenous organization called Better Beginnings, Better Futures, and we were running a teen center. And it really planted some seeds about the lack of safe space for young people. Fast forward a few years later, and I'm in Sault Ste. Marie, back in my hometown. I finished my degree in community economic and social development, and started participating with the water protectors. So I have another group that starts with Boating. But the water protectors, what they did is they came together and they started talking about the need, water's life, and the need to protect it. And it was like a surgence at the time. They actually do dump nuclear waste in Elliott Lake near where I live. So that water protects was so important. But from that, I met other young people that were energized and had fire in their bellies to make change. And we started Youth Odana. Ode means heart or love. So it's where the hearts of young people come together. So Odaman is strawberry, right? So Youth Odana was about creating safe space for young people, and we started that in 2016. So, our first grant, thank you, Laidlaw, was with Laidlaw in 2017, and you know, a $30,000 grant. Does that ever seem like a lot of money when you live off food bank food? Wow. I was just fresh out of university. I worked minimum wage, and we wanted to create safe space pop-ups for young Indigenous folks, and all non-Indigenous folks also, just youth in general in the Sioux. And we were able to do that with funding from Laidlaw Foundation. We went on at Youth Odana to get several rounds of funding over years to do different things. So I think what our needs and our understanding shifted, right? So first we're like, oh yeah, we have safe space, we have nowhere to go, we're so bored you Sioux. And then it shifted into like, oh, we have somewhere to go, but we'd actually like to learn things. We'd like to learn skills, we'd like to learn from our elders, we'd like to like reclaim some of that culture. So we shifted into that. And then we realized that we're all parents now, except for me, I'm just surviving out here. But all of my peers we're parents now. And you know, there was a lot of women at the table. So we realized that, you know, like young women, parents and aunties, that we kind of had a space and a voice. So we started like sharing circles, if you will, where we would, you know, give each other gifts and talk about what was going on at home. And we'd have different facilitators come and talk to us, and really created a bond, which was really important, especially when you have so much lateral violence going on, to like stick together as community and create sisterhood. And you know, remember our clan systems and ground in those. What was the roles of our clans, and you know, how can we bring that to the table in our circles together? So it really shifted. And then Youth Odana started working with kids that were in child welfare. I have a background in child welfare myself. I lived in three actually, but two long-term foster homes when I was younger as a small child, and then in group homes as a teen. And later worked as a residential youth worker with a former group home mate, Jen. So Jen and I started using Youth Odana, the vehicle, to help Indigenous youth in foster care or in the child welfare system, because I wouldn't describe it as care, but within the system, to actualize their dreams. So we did the Strawberry Moon Festival, where we talked about, you know, moon teachings and you know, some basics of Anishinaabe ways with the youth in care. But then we realized that Youth Odana wasn't the vehicle for this. That Youth Odana really needed to be for safe space and for youth to build skills and to be their vehicle. And that, you know, barriers that our youth were facing in the child welfare system were their own beast. So then we founded Rewarding Child Welfare Warriors, because kids were coming to us, and it wasn't like, oh, I would like to do a craft, I'm wanting to do my personal development. No, kids were coming to us like, we're homeless, no one's listening to us, we don't know where we're going, we don't know what to eat, I don't have ID, my worker doesn't listen to me, they don't care. But you care. I remembered you cared. I remembered you listened to me. I found you, and I need your help. And this was happening frequently to me and Jen. So we got together, and we were inspired actually by the child welfare survivors here in Toronto. We were inspired by them, and so we talked to them, and we said, you know what, we have this going on in Doughty, and would it be okay if we created a similar group but with our own values up here in the north? And they said, yes, please do that. We should have these organizations everywhere. Only we know the solutions because we've lived it. So, okay, thank you. So we started Rewarding Child Welfare Warriors, Jen and I, and it started with where we could start. Kids were aging out of care and they didn't have ID to access social welfare. They didn't have bank accounts, and their workers weren't listening to them. So those were the three main things and they're houseless, like homeless, like, you know, couch surfing, don't know where they're gonna go. Those were the main things. So we started with addressing those, and again, we're funded by Laidlaw. Thank you, Laidlaw. You actually helped many of our youth actually exit homelessness. So what we would do is come in and be a bridge. So we started there, but then we started working on self-advocacy and teaching the kids how to self-advocate, send emails, keep a paper trail, understand what's happening. Also keep a calendar and just those basic things so that they're able to self-advocate for themselves. And from that, we can kind of get in their corner and say, hey, we're Bwatting Child Welfare Warriors. Well, who else might be able to help you? Can the Indigenous Friendship Center help you? You know, can someone come to your meeting with your child welfare worker so that they know that you're heard and you're listening and there's people watching? So we created communities of care for each individual as they were navigating the system. And then we created art about it because they deserve to feel empowered and not weak and strong like the beautiful humans that they are. So we created I Don't Know Where I'm Going to Live, which is a short video that's 3 to 5 minutes. I think it's like 3.5 minutes. And right now we're in the process of making another piece of art. We also have like individual interviews where people talk about the things that they have experienced that we will turn into research, and then we will turn it into a best practice recommendation and then bring it back to all of you. So that's kind of where I started, is like just to ground it back and not take up too much space, is I was a scrappy kid living off of food banks, learning how to write grants, and slowly was able, and with my privilege, which I recognize, to access education. And then from accessing education, I understood I was a writer and I'm a talker. So understood how to start closing some of these gaps. All the while in there, I still needed to work a day job and eat. So I worked retail, I worked in child welfare, I worked in group homes, and I was so privileged to work just entirely off of grants with the Northern Lights Collaborative at Catalyst X. After that, I segued into my career at Youth Opportunities Fund, and I was grateful to be a program manager for almost 3 years, and then was scouted to become the director of Ontario Indigenous Youth Partnership Project by my steering committee, who asked me to come and work here. So, you know, over the last 10 years, my knowledge, say in 2016, 2017, was like, hey, I see this big problem. I have a big voice. I want to talk about it. How can I fix it? And then here I am 10 years later, I'm the director of a small funder. And then I'm teaching or paneling about what to do. So I think the grounding where I'd like to leave off is that we need to invest in people and not just in like, oh, you've checked this box, you have this impact, this deliverable, but actually caring about them as people and following them throughout their career. I mean, if willing, obviously relationship building is so important, reciprocity is so important. Not only are you offering dollars, but what do they have to offer you, and how can we work together to move forward? Make question.
Okay. So what I'm gonna do right now is I'm actually gonna open it up to the Q&A. So for folks online, if there are any questions, please feel free to put it in the chat, and then one of our staff will read it off for you. And then I'm gonna open it up to the folks in the room. Any questions, any thoughts for the panelists, something for everyone? Yes, if you can state your name and.
My name is Don. And I noticed that at the beginning we talked about the history of Laidlaw. It sounds like they were lumber barons in the beginning of the 19th century. You have a similar thing happening today. I'm thinking of northwestern Quebec, where I work, where there's lithium mines are opening in the Cree territories, and which means that they're building camps. People are from Montreal are being flown in, they're building camps, has an impact on these guys going out fishing and hunting, et cetera, et cetera. So my question is, does what you guys have been doing with the research with the Truth and Reconciliation have any kind of impact with this repetition of the cycle of resource extraction and colonization that's going on right now. I think we're talking about rail spurs being built to.
Can I provide a response? Dawn?
Yeah.
Thank you, Dawn. I actually would love to just have a quick response to this. Please. So, one of the things that continues to exist is although there's a lot of money that flows from foundations in this country to a number of organizations, the largest number of dollars held by foundations is actually in investments. And those investments absolutely can continue to invest in projects that cause harm to this day on lands and territories that are Indigenous peoples' lands and territories across the globe. There are a number of foundations and philanthropic entities and family houses that are thinking differently about their investment strategies. Share is an organization that has an investment tool that is about reconciliation and responsible investing, that is meant to be a helpful guidepost for organizations who are like, they're not directly involved in lithium mining or in kind of forestry practices, but their investments likely are, right? So whether it's in real estate or if it's in mining or if it's in water, et cetera, child labor, there are ways that people can think differently about how to use their power. And especially, I mean, we're talking largely about grant making in the philanthropic sector, but the bigger amount of money that no one really talks about is actually about their investments, right? So their investments are in the multiple billions of dollars in this country. They are being invested in ways that could be far more responsible than they are. And so I think that there are strategies, and I think we don't talk enough about how those things could actually be taken. The other piece is that Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities should also learn about how they can advocate to the places they give their money to say, are you screening for environmental damage? Are you screening for child labor? Are you screening for the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People? Are you screening to ensure gender equity? These are some of the questions folks can ask when they're giving their generosity to organizations who are investing in.
I just want to add, so that is an amazing point, because when we're talking about granting philanthropy, that's the 5%. And what Kris just brought up is the 95% of the equity in this sector. And it does not get enough attention. I just want to kind of, the question was very big and almost like beyond our sector, but it's not that, you know, resourcism, land displacement, and all the ugly things that come with it. I know there's a lot of impact, not just on Indigenous communities, but local communities and stuff like that. As a band counselor, I've been sitting in negotiations for like resourcism and nuclear waste in my territory and stuff like that. And because I'm also a fundraiser, and so before I joined the council, I volunteered to fundraise for the powwow. And, you know, I said, I'm not going to start from scratch. Give me your list of all your donors, funders from previous years, and, you know, I'll pick it up from there. And it was all corporate. It was all corporate. I was like, oh crap, we're going down this corporate donors, you know, tunnel. So I did what I did. I, you know, approached these companies, not necessarily my comfort level, but it was the comfort level of the community. So I followed suit. I noticed one name that was left off the list that I thought was an obvious approach. And the chief and council at the time, they said, no, we don't want anything from them. We're still in historical negotiations for land owed to us for development and resources in our territory unconsensually for 60 years. We do not want them performatively throwing $100,000 or a couple $1,000s our way to fund our powwow when they owe us so much more. And so they're very conscious of the fact that these corporate foundations that are operating in the name of the bigger corporations are just, you know, sprinkling pennies around to communities that are affected by their work and devastation, to say, look, we're helping them. Look, we're in good partnership. They're almost trying to buy like performative partnership. And so, I mean, community leaders, they're not stupid. They know exactly what they're getting into when they accept money from Bruce Power. I mean, I had to actually even script letters memorandum and notes, memorandum of understandings to say this donation or this capital corporate donation will not impact, you know, current or future dealings for treaty negotiations, claims, and et cetera. Just to satisfy Chief Counsel and to make sure our corporate partners were not trying to leverage this, you know, meager transfer corporate sponsorship as some sort of tool or token to say, look how good we're doing with this community engagement we promised in our reconciliation action board and yada, yada, yada. So yeah, and I see it more and more and more now. We have more and more foundations that are attached to corporations. And because of the TRC, you know, because they're all, you know, jumping on board and getting their reconciliation action plans in order, well, behind the social sector, well behind the charitable sector. You know, they are really looking for quick, low-hanging fruit to take, you know, grants or corporate sponsorships without actually doing investing the time to create those reciprocal relationships, those relationships of trust. And you know, there are so many amazing organizations, Indigenous-led organizations, groups, grassroots, who are developing tools because we see this happening. And some people who are new to the sector might not realize that they're being tokenized. By, you know, accepting those grants, applying for their grants. Like, you know, they might be so new, they're like, oh, I got this 30,000, this is great. But we know as seasoned Indigenous professionals in this sector, what exactly is going on with those youth groups who are getting that money, who are getting their pictures taken, who are getting put in their annual reports. And that is not how we want philanthropy to be done. That is performative, and that continues to happen in this sector. So like there is a lot of performative stuff in this sector, as Kris had mentioned. And you know, the second question I don't think we got to because we got into such great conversation of what we want for the future of the sector, and that, you know, that people are more conscious of, you know, the implications of that performance, that they're more consciously building these relationships. And I know Kris has been saying this, I know so many of us in the sector have been saying, like, you need to slow down, to take time, to reflect, to build those relationships. You cannot just act like an ATM. And it is so heartwarming. It is so refreshing to see that organizations, youth groups, grassroots are really saying, no, we are not going to accept your money, not on your terms, not with, you know, this MOU or your expectations, but on our terms, right? So that's where I want to see the sector go. Like, there's so much resistance to sharing power or relinquishing power. So few organizations are just becoming comfortable with sharing power. I want to see the relinquish of power, the relinquish of assets, so that we are driving the sector for ourselves by ourselves.
Love that. Which segues into basically what I would say a call to action from the panelists. So look around the room. Can I get all the people who work at a foundation to raise their hands? Thank you so much. Don't be shy. Okay, great. Just so everybody can see you. Great. So now let's get into the call to action, and you know who you're talking to.
Yeah, and it kind of stems from the last conversation too, is like, can you stop making people jump hoops so that you can get your reconciliation button? We all wear them proudly. But yeah, so like intersectionality is such a beautiful thing. And I have very many intersectionalities. But then it turns into just checking boxes. I've made sure, and then I'm worried, or you know, the writer is worried. Did I check the right boxes? Instead of just, you know, grounding in what their values and what is important to them. And then you conforming like, oh, maybe I need to change some of my boxes. When I say you, I mean the philanthropic sector, not the individuals who are beautiful and sitting here, but the people that are designing the way we're interacting with the sector. Can we actually go out and scout folks that are doing good work from their own perspective in their own community and invest in them without restriction? Without, you know, I need to see A, B, and C, and D from you, or you actually are at risk of being rescinded. Those types of transactions, like you said, ATM is really harmful. And that's where philanthropic dollars can be harmful rather than helpful. So yeah, stop checking boxes, I guess is my for sure. And I'm glad I'm not the only one who had notes on their phone. I also believe, there was like, we're talking about the last 10 years. So there was a shift working from home, when we were like in COVID. And that really got people thinking and innovative. And there was a huge flux of dollars. Like, oh yes, people of color, Indigenous people, they are suffering the most through this pandemic because we know historically they are the folks that are suffering, right? So that kind of blanket. And then there was an influx, COVID-19 this, COVID-19 that, COVID this. And then the pandemic ended and it was like it deflated and we stopped looking at what was happening. And we stopped investing in those emergent ways, right? In these creative ways where we're like, oh, that person's doing this over here. Let's go and fund them over there, and doing that work where we're going out and looking for them. So I think that we need to have like a shift back to what we were doing with COVID and really individualizing how we're funding communities, really looking at what communities want, and then rising to those needs, rising to those gaps, rather than always just the call out funding. And I work for a call out funder. Our funding will open in March 1st until March 31st. We gave away $116,000 this year. I'd love to give away $200,000 next year, but I'll need some foundational help. I brought cards. But really what we need to do is look at routing, as Kris said, that money where it's supposed to be, into the hands of Indigenous folks who have their own autonomy and sovereignty and understand how to invest in their communities better than we ever could, right? And we have to just trust that. And we have to not be so worried about, misspending, or, if they're going to pass the audit. You know what? Every year, one of your people is going to misspend or not pass the audit. But you have to, invest from a place of trust and reciprocity, that there's room enough for that errors. And also the money's not coming from your pocket. So you know what? You're still gonna eat. So I think that those things are kind of most important. Am I at time?
In terms
I'm
of
at time. Let's share.
But thank you so much. That was, yes, super important. For the rest of the panel, if I can get like rapid fires call to actions, and then we're gonna obviously mingle afterwards. So when the folks in the room held their hands up, you kind of had an eye on who was there. Now you know who to talk to afterwards. Carissa.
No, no.
Okay.
Okay. So I just want to highlight again that Janine was the first Indigenous chair of a private philanthropic foundation. That's within the past 7 years. So 10 years from now, I want to see so many Indigenous chairs, that for so much representation on boards, that it is unusual to not have Indigenous staff or Indigenous board members.
Yes,
That's a real thing.
Bet stole my call to action. In a similar vein, I would say, recruit Indigenous board members, volunteers, advisors. Take chances on wild cards like me and Ben. Because I think that so much of what I learned being on this board, in this sector, being invited into these learning spaces, networking spaces, conferences, has really informed who I am as a leader. And I want to see young people on Indigenous Advisory Council pipelines to governance, having says at the table, and so that they can gain that leadership experience and take it back out into their community. And don't do it in a performative or tokenistic way. Make sure that you can and you are willing to support them as an authentic whole person. Like I said, I was offered childcare, even DoorDash to my babysitter and my child, taxi rides home when it was too late. So many things I was offered just to show up as myself and fully participate. And they stood by me through very difficult incidences of white supremacy. I was always supported when I voiced up those difficult situations, because they are there, they will always be there. But the best thing you can do is like wrap, that community of support to insulate the person who is entering into a sector that is predominantly male, pale, and stale. So. On that mic drop.
Either one.
I think it goes back to, for me, it's the more I've unlearned Western ideologies and perspectives and just sort of, we're indoctrinated in this society to think and to perform and to speak and to look a certain way, and so much of our daily lives. But that also obviously goes all the way up to the top of the triangle. I don't like that analogy, because I think, it's, again, that hierarchical system is what is really breaking society right now, is that division of classes and just the dehumanization of people just depending on their intersectionalities. So I'd say, like, a lot of what we do, even in our daily lives, is very based on paternal, even with Laidlaw, or not Laidlaw, but I can't say that word, philanthropic. You know what I'm talking about. It's a very paternal relationship. Here, I'm gonna give you money and you need to perform a certain way. And that brings me back to being a child and getting allowance from my parents, right? And I had guidelines and I had rules to follow, and it helped me learn how to budget and learn how to spend my money. But it's like a teeter-totter of where does it get toxic? Where does it get controlling? Where does it get to be like we're putting our ideologies on you to follow through with it? So my call to action, I think, would be to decenter Western frameworks and really start to recenter non-Western frameworks. And depending on, it's grantee or the group that you're working with, it's going to change. Western coastal Indigenous communities is different than Northern Indigenous communities. It's different than East Coast Indigenous communities versus Plains, right? So Indigenous people aren't a monolith. We're not just this group. There's community by community. There's different needs. A lot of them are very similar, but there's different ideas and needs. And like you were saying, investing in those people and those ideas specifically, and decentering the paternal, like, watchdog relationship. I think it's more of that turning back to the matriarchy and to the maternal and the nurturing and the, really breathing air into the next generation so that they can continue to hopefully, we talk about 10 years from now. I'm thinking 100 years from now, where are we going to be? Where's the Indigenous community going to be in Canada and in the world? And I really would hope to see that not only in Canada, but, in parts of Asia and Africa and the South, like south of the equator. There's so many opportunities for us as a race to really become better than we are. And I think that's really by decentering Western ideologies and frameworks.
Yes.
I would say to the funders in the room, what you're hearing here today should not be new to any of you. And so the advice would be to heed what you hear. But the other thing that I would say is use your influence, your social capital, your whiteness, your proximity to whiteness and to power, your proximity to grant making, to investment decisions, to mobilize the dollars to where the pain has been, and turn that money into medicine. And one of the ways to do that quickly is if you find yourself in a position where you might want to build relationship, a little opposite of what has been said, don't start with saying, can we have a relationship? Start with handing over money and leaving people alone so they can do their good work. And when their organizations are stable, because they have multi-year general operating dollars, they might come back around and say, hey, Ontario Trillium Foundation, hey, Laidlaw, hey, whoever else. Thanks for that ability for us to hire staff and to be a stable organization. Now we'll talk about partnership because there can be some mutual reciprocity. If you have money to move it fast. It does not take years. Write the check, get out of the way, let people come to you when they're ready and or desiring a relationship. And the other thing, if you're serious about making real changes, recognize this is not a 1-year project or even a 3-year project. It is going to be decades long. It's going to be a decades long requirement to be accompanying Indigenous folks in relationship to do this good work.
I love that. Turn money into.
Oh my. Didn't I tell y'all it was gonna be a great panel? Thank you so much again,